If you like the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment. For more videos like this. What's the creepiest thing you've seen while driving at night? Driving in the backwoods in northern GA heading home. Moon is out, but this country-ass road had no streetlights, so basically my headlights are it. I can see silhouettes of things on the side of the road ahead of me. This massive shape comes out from behind a tree and begins squirming along the side of the road up ahead. I slow down and ponder if I want to go forward anymore because, while I had no idea what it is, I do know it's large. Looks about as tall as my car, and just as long, and I thought I saw spikes on its back. And it's moving weird. I decide screw it and begin slowly going forward. I'm in a car, it can handle anything the state of GA can throw at it. Get closer to the thing and notice it's undulating funny. Turn ever so slightly to hit it with my headlights. It was a deer trying to hump another deer and I guess not quite getting in there. I didn't stop laughing until I got home because I was sure for a moment I was going to be attacked by some ancient, unspeakable demon. I grew up in rural Kansas near the Oklahoma border, lived about 30 miles from the nearest town for a good chunk of that time on a cattle ranch. Very isolated, very dark, and very creepy at night. We had some neighbors not too far off from us. They lived maybe 5 or 6 miles away on the main road that led to my house. These people owned 2 very large dogs that looked similar to each other, retriever mixes I believe. Anyway, I was about 16 driving home by myself after some high school event. I knew I had a long drive home, so I kind of zoned out for most of it, but when I got maybe 3 miles away from my neighbors, I spotted 2 animal eyes staring at me from the side of the road. Deer are a huge problem out here, so I started paying good attention to the eyes, and lo and behold one of the neighbor's dogs emerged from the brush. Now, I am a huge softie especially when it comes to animals, and Midwestern politeness is a very real thing. So, naturally, I pulled over to grab the dog and take it back to his owners. Note, ordinarily I wouldn't have done something like this, but we were pretty far from their house and we'd been having lots of coyote problems. I didn't want him getting attacked by a pack, which I instantly recognized as the wrong decision. Now, I don't know how many of you have been out in the middle of BFE, USA, but it is a dark place. There was almost no light pollution where I lived and you could see big stretches of galaxy on clear nights. As soon as I cracked my door, my stomach dropped. I realized I was a dumb teenage girl, pulled over on the side of a dark highway, alone, at night. Mama didn't raise no pussy, though, so I called out for the dog behind me where I'd seen it while I was driving. Nothing. No rustling, no happy dog noises, nothing. It was silent. Starting to get a little wigged out, I decided that the dog could more than likely find his own way home. I turned around and sat back in my car, and the dog is sitting in my headlights staring at me straight on. I suddenly was filled with this feeling of absolute, inescapable dread. I'd never felt so uncomfortably fearful. There was no way the dog could have gotten ahead of me. I was going 70 when I saw it, so I wasn't near it anymore when I pulled over, and I would have heard either his nails clacking on the pavement or him rustling the long grass on the other side of my car when he walked by. I'd already shut my door by this point, but I yelled at the dog anyway, just to see if it would move. Really? Still nothing. Like a statue. Weird. Deciding that I'd had enough ate-up events for the night, I just put my car in gear and gunned it the fuck out of there. The dog's head swiveled to follow me, body never moving, just watching me drive away. I was thoroughly creeped out by this point and thought, maybe the dog was sick? Did it have rabies or something? As I considered, I passed the neighbor's house, the ones that owned the dogs. Their house was off the highway, far enough that they had a streetlight in the yard, but not so far that I couldn't see in their front yard. I looked over to see if their other dog was there, and both of their dogs were sleeping soundly under the light. When they heard my car, they perked their ears and wagged their tails. Both of the dogs were most definitely there. I still don't know exactly what the shit that thing was that I saw. It didn't act like a dog in any way. I'm not usually into that type of lore, but this incident really kinda made me believe in skinwalkers. If that thing was a real dog, that just happened to look identical to some nearby dogs that I knew of, wandering around the Kansas backwoods by itself after dark, I will eat my hat. I remember when I was kid driving down an old dirt road at night with my mom in the middle of the woods. When suddenly the car stopped abruptly. I remember looking at my mom and she had a look of horror on her face as she was looking out the front windshield. She was kind of panicking. Then I looked out and saw what she was looking at, and at that moment have never been so scared in my life. There sitting in the middle of the road was a tiny little man, almost like a Keebler elf, only straight from your worst nightmare, from the depths of hell. He was just standing there, hat and all, staring at us for what seemed like an eternity. It seemed like my mom, myself, and this creepy little elf were all frozen in fear. It was like he knew we shouldn't be seeing him. He was just staring blankly at us with these very dark, almost pitch black eyes. Then all of a sudden this tiny little demon elf started to move. In fact, it started to hop. It hopped away. It was a fucking rabbit. My mom and I, both relieved, started laughing, then went home. That's why when people say that have seen Bigfoot or a ghost, anything of the sort, I give them the benefit of the doubt, because if my mom and I had turned around and left before the rabbit hopped away for the rest of our lives, we both would have been convinced we saw a tiny woodland elf. Either that or creepy magic elves do live in the woods and have the magic ability to turn into rabbits. We were driving in the mountains in Colorado with some friends on our way to a ski lodge in Telluride. On the way to our hotel, we were driving up and down these winding roads deep in the mountains, which seemed like forever. It was pitch black outside and around 3 a.m. and we had to at least be 45-ish minutes from the nearest town, and it was cold, like see your own breath, below 10 degrees freezing cold. As we were driving along, my friends and I all see 4 figures walking on the road coming towards us. We all get weird feelings inside, but I did especially, and the hair on my neck stood up. Something didn't seem right. We were way too far away from a town and it was way too cold for hitchhikers or hikers of any sort. We get closer and closer, and as we got right next to these people we slowed down and we realized that they literally had no faces. 4 people walking in the dead of the night wearing black hoods and cape-like gowns, and they had no faces. And by no faces I mean like no eyes, mouth, ears, just blank faces, almost white in color. I'm familiar with ski masks, and these were not ski masks. They had hoods on like something from Scream almost. My friends and I all freaked the fuck out, speeding away, and my toughest, manliest friend of us all was crying. Mind you, he was in his late 20s. It was the most afraid I've ever been, and it still scares me thinking about and typing out. No idea what they were or anything. Demons maybe? It will forever be a mystery. We didn't sleep well the next few nights/months. This wasn't particularly scary creepy, but I still have no idea what I saw. I leave my house for work every morning at 6 a.m. and during much of the year it's pitch black at that time. One road I take is very windy and backwoodsy. As I came to a bend I saw ahead of me, but off the road, since the road began to turn, a floating light as if my headlights were illuminating something. It fluttered like a butterfly or insect, but it was entirely too big to be one, and what insect is lit up by headlights? So I think maybe it's a deer's eyes. Except it's in front of the tree line and I see no body. Also the movement pattern didn't match. Same with a bird or bat, they would have been a much quicker swooping motion rather than a slow, up and down fluttering motion. I still don't know what I saw. I don't believe in fairies, but dang if that isn't the closest thing I can think of. I used to work at a summer camp set way the hell in the middle of the forest. Only way to access it was through a badly maintained dirt road that turned off of the highway. No lights, surrounded by trees and forest on both sides, and almost no light from the stars and the moon. Needless, it was almost always creepy to drive through there at night. One night, I was coming back from the nearest town. It was around 12 to 1 a.m. I'm driving up the road with my high beams on. But you have to realize just how dark it gets in the woods after sundown. These are ancient, deep northern Canadian forests. Even with my high beams on, it felt like the light was barely penetrating the darkness. It's about a 5 to 6 kilometers drive through the dirt road into the camp. Not a big distance, really, but when you're driving in the pitch black darkness on a badly maintained gravel road, it can feel like forever. So, I'm driving, and all of a sudden, about 30 to 40 feet in front of me, I see a shape that looks vaguely human standing stock still. I slow down, inch forward, and try to make out to see if it's one of my colleagues from work who got stranded here somehow. The figure is standing in a weird way, in the middle of the road sort of, but slightly to the right and facing sideways into the forest so that I couldn't see his face. I keep driving, slowly, and I blink my headlights at him to see if he needs help. No response. I inch forward some more, and now I'm right beside him. He's about 6 to 7 feet away from on my right. Still can't make out his face because it's turned away from me, and my headlights are facing forward while he's on my side. I open the window and call out and ask if he's lost or needs help. No answer. No movement. At this point I consider getting out of the car, but something stopped me. I just felt a weird chill. The whole thing was just a bit too eerie for me. I stood still in the car for a few seconds. Still no movement from the figure. I thought, fuck it, and I drove off into the safety and lights of the camp. The next morning I told my friends what had happened, but they brushed it off, saying it may have been a lost hiker or canoeist who got turned around. Makes sense, but at 11 p.m. at night? No bags or hiking gear on him? Standing still like a shadow in the pitch darkness. I still don't know who it was that night. I've since driven that road many times, alone and with friends, and I've never seen anything like it. but every time I drive by that spot on the road I still get chills. Late one night my wife and I were driving to visit my parents. We were in separate cars, and she was following me. We were out in the country, in the middle of nowhere, and we were probably going at least 55 or 60 miles per hour. Suddenly, a large light gray or white animal came out of nowhere and started running alongside her car. This was rural West Texas, so deer were pretty common, but this thing wasn't shaped like a deer and it didn't run like one. It was a bulky shape, not lean, and it loped, rather than sprinted like a deer does. It only ran alongside her for less than a minute, then it darted in front of her. She hit it, and it was flung off to the side. We didn't stop until we got to town. When we looked at her front bumper there was a smear of blood and a few hairs. It happened too fast for her to see what it was. She just saw a large white blur and felt a thud when she hit it. My dad suggested that it could have been a goat or a sheep, but I don't think it was shaped right for that. A lot of ranchers in that area keep Great Pyrenees to guard their livestock, so it could have been one of those. However, it was big, even for one of them, and I don't see how a dog could have kept up with a car like that. The thing my wife hit did. I work nights and one day I forgot my lunch at home. I didn't have money to spend, so I decided to go home on my lunch hour and eat my sandwich on the way back. I was in a hurry, so I took the back roads. At about halfway there, as I was speeding and noticed a woman in a white night dress without shoes standing in the road in the other lane. I slowed down as I passed her, thinking she was probably drunk and didn't want her to jump out in front of me or anything like that. It wasn't till later, as I was on my way back, that I started to think how odd it was. Why would someone be in the middle of the road in their bare feet at 2:30 a.m.? But I just reassure myself that the woman was probably just drunk. Used to work second shift, got off around 11:30 one night, drove over to my girlfriend's house and stayed there for a few hours. A pretty bad thunderstorm starts up and I decide to head home. My dog hates storms, didn't want to leave her alone. There's two ways back to my house from hers. One runs through town and takes 20 minutes or so. One is a single lane dirt road and only takes about 8 minutes. This night I chose the dirt road. There are 0 houses on this dirt road for about an 8-mile stretch. It's raining hard as hell. I'm in the middle of the Alabama backwoods creeping down this dirt road. I come around a curve and there is a very large man standing right in the middle of the road, wearing a black hoodie with his hood up, dark colored pants, and dark shoes. I slammed on the brakes and stopped. He takes a few steps towards my truck, and I freaked out and threw my truck into reverse, backed up, and he runs towards me and then darts into the woods. Due to being in the middle of nowhere, I didn't have cell reception, so as soon as I got home I called the cops and reported it. 2 nights later a woman had a similar experience. He actually tried to get into her car. Police searched the woods several times and found a camp but never found the guy. This one time I was driving home from a night class and hit a deer on a road about a mile away from home. The thing went flying and fell in a ditch on the side of the road. I immediately pulled over and grabbed a flashlight to see if the deer was okay. I'm not sure how it managed to get away without me noticing, but it was gone as soon as I was out of the car. I looked around for a bit to see if I could find it and determine if I needed to get someone to put it down or if it would be fit to let go. This wasn't the first deer I've hit. What was kinda creepy though, after looking around I was completely surrounded by deer on both sides of the road. All of whom were just staring at me, completely frozen and silent, like they were judging me. I was driving a van across Switzerland on the Autobahn in the dark, very little lighting. As I came down the hillside into a valley I noticed what I thought was a man running down the right-hand lane. In the distance it's 2 to 2:30 a.m., some moonlight. As I get closer he's running really strangely, like loping, so as I'm going past him, I decided not to stop. Out of politeness and not to blind him I flick my main beams off, and as I do it it turned his head and his eyes reflected like a dog. Every hair stood up on my body and I put my foot down. There were no woods around or houses, and the nearest town must have been 30 miles. Truly terrifying. My parents live in the middle of nowhere, and you have to drive through miles of empty farmland to get to their house with nothing but hay and the occasional group of cows or horses to give variety to the view. I was on my way back home from a visit sometime between 11 and 12 a.m., and I spotted a huge mass on the road as I crested a hill and had to hit my brakes and swerve around. I didn't hit it, but I pulled over to the shoulder and backed up because my first thought was, oh God, it's a dead deer, gotta haul it off the road or someone is gonna die. Well, as I neared it, it was clear that it was way too bulky for a deer. My tail lights lighted up when I was about 10 feet away, and it became clear that it was an enormous, and I mean enormous, male hog that was still alive and just laying there huffing and puffing with its guts all poured out on the road. I had no way of getting that thing off the road. They weigh many hundreds of pounds, but I figured I'd call the police at least and make someone aware. So I put my car in park and dialed 911. As I was telling the lady on the line about the hog, I got curious and backed up a bit closer so I could see it more clearly in the light of my car lights. Its guts weren't spilled out because it had been hit by a car. It was very clearly the victim of something huge taking a bite out of it. I mean, a whole chunk about the length of my forearm was missing from its stomach, and there was a dark trail of blood where it had crawled onto the road and then collapsed. I noped the fuck right out of there and never stopped until I got home. Hogs are huge creatures, and as far as I knew the biggest carnivores living in the area were coyotes, but this was no bite from a canine. Middle of nowhere rural PA, heading to a state park known for stargazing. I knew that it was a slow, dark, boring drive even though it wasn't that far, but it was all windy narrow mountain roads and very dark. We're on the main road, still about half-hour away from the turn we need to make when I see a sign telling us to turn left to go to that park. I'd heard they were connecting a couple of roads and that there'd be a shortcut to the park from this main road, so I assumed it was finished and we'd stumbled onto it. We turned left to take the shortcut and almost immediately regretted it. In just 2 to 3 miles, we'd gone from beautiful, quaint countryside to some creepy dilapidated town that scared the bejesus out of me. My husband seemed fine, so I told myself I was just overreacting. I see a fire up ahead to the left, near a fork in the road. As we get closer, it appears to be an enormous bonfire surrounded by wrong-turn type mutants all milling about the fire. They were some shitty campers and a couple of trucks parked around them. The houses looked like tar paper shacks or the oldest, cheapest hunting cabins you've ever seen. The whole scene was depressing. They were all guys and all dressed like old-timey prospectors or something. Looked like the mountain men guys who hunt Bigfoots and such, but totally menacing and evil. About 15 to 20 guys, no women or children in sight even though it's only like 8 p.m., but it's winter in PA so fully night. As we approached, they all stopped talking and turned to stare at our vehicle, then a couple started walking towards the road. I was consumed by this overwhelming feeling of dread and suddenly scared for my life. Before I could say a word, my husband floored it, probably doubling our speed, and swerved around the creepers as we flew up the hill, taking the fork on the right. He was white-knuckling it and slowed as soon as the fire faded from my sight, but I was terrified that they'd come after us. My husband just said, "I don't know what the fuck that was, but it wasn't fucking people. Where the fuck are we?" The whole thing was so frightening, but I couldn't really express why I was so terrified. I just was. My husband is never afraid of anything, real or paranormal. We've explored a number of haunted sites and he's totally unfazed by everything. He gets happy and excited when I'm ready to have a heart attack and pee myself, so the fact that he was freaking out scared me more than anything. We eventually made it to the park but didn't stay long as we were both exhausted and still on edge. We did not leave the way we came and took our usual route back, avoiding the new road to the park. We talked about it all night but really couldn't figure out what was going on there that scared us so much, just that the people and the place itself seemed wrong and evil. He put it best when he said those fucking hillbilly mutants looked like they'd eat you and rape me. So once the sun was up in the morning we decided to go back and check it out in the daylight. We took the same major road and made the same left turn at the sign for the state park. We were in a small town that looked nothing like what we'd seen the night before. There was a little gas station and a tiny market on the right and some small but neat houses on the left. We eventually came to the fork in the road, but the field to the left where we saw the weirdos and the fire and everything was mostly a pond. We checked maps, drove around for hours and talked to locals, but there was no other turn off of the main road pointing towards the state park except for that turn and the 1 mile further ahead that we normally used. That was almost 10 years ago and I still have no idea what the hell we saw that night. I had just seen a midnight showing at the cinema with my 2 friends and our park was almost empty. We get into my car, start up, and a car pulls up and parks in the space next to me. I look over and there's a guy staring directly into my car at me and he just had a really creepy look about him. I motioned with my hand to him to see if he wanted anything, but he continued to stare without responding. We started getting freaked out at this point, bearing in mind it was almost 3 a.m. and we were in an almost empty car park. I decided just to drive off, but as soon as I went he began to follow. He followed me all the way out of the car park, out of the junction, and all the way up to a roundabout. Determined to lose this creep, I went around the roundabout a few times and finally managed to get away. He may have just wanted directions or something, but staring at 3 girls in a dark car park and following them sure is a weird way to go about asking. One late night, when I was around 12 or so, my older sister, her boyfriend, and I were driving back home from one of those Halloween haunted houses. We were talking and laughing about how much we jumped and yelled when we passed a car pulled over to the side. Normally this wouldn't be odd, but it was a busy 4-lane highway and the driver's side door was left open with no emergency blinkers on. Just as we're all having a that's weird moment, suddenly we zoom past a woman wearing a white coat less than foot away from the car. I turned around as we passed and saw her just swaying in the road, not really trying to move one way or the other. Of course my imagination went wild. Maybe she was an escaped mental patient? Maybe she was possessed? Being around Halloween, all those thoughts seemed natural. Talking about it with my sister, even years later, she was probably trying to kill herself. I don't know what happened to her, but sometimes when I'm driving late at night, I still think about seeing her face, distorted by speed and darkness, through my window. This probably isn't that scary unless you happen to be there, and happen to be a wimp like me, but it still freaks me out a little, so I'll write it out. My buddy and I got out of a movie around 1 or 2 a.m. in a part of town we weren't really familiar with, and as we were leaving we got kind of turned around, but we figured we were close to the highway and would find it either way. Well, we were wrong apparently, because we kept heading in one direction until the sound of the highway completely disappeared and it just kept getting darker and darker and quieter and quieter. Like, I'm sure it was just our imagination, but it honestly looked like it was getting continuously harder to see even though it was already dead of night with no street lamps and our headlights were on. And we were still within city limits, but everything just kept getting more and more foresty looking the further we drove. This is all within a few minutes, mind you. Eventually we were just looking for a good place to turn around, but it took us forever to find it. Eventually we did manage to turn around and find our way back to the highway, but not before experiencing this weird, primal, psychological horror that we were going to get sucked into the abyss or whatever. Anyway, that's all that came of it. Like I said, we're wimps. I was driving home late one night. Somewhere between 1 and 3 a.m. The stretch of road I was driving goes through the back end of a couple of counties in the deep south. Nothing around but forests, fields, and the occasional group of shacks huddling under a light that only barely keeps away the night. I'd driven this stretch of road many times before, even at this time of night, so it wasn't really a big deal. Just a long trip. Since there was rarely any traffic that time of night, during the day you could always count on at least a handful of cars somewhere around, I was able to turn the stereo up and push the pedal down. And then I came to this bridge. Nothing really noteworthy about it. It's not ancient or a covered bridge or all that spooky. Just a concrete span over swampland, trees growing right up near the edge and turning the road into a dim trail at the bottom of a dark canyon. I'd been over this bridge many times before, and aside from being fairly long, it wasn't really noteworthy. Until that night. It was humid out, and as the temperature dropped there was a little bit of fog. Not enough to really slow me down, but I had to turn off the high beams. So I'm shooting across the bridge and it hits me that it seems to be taking longer than normal to get across it. Maybe I was just tired? Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me? And then I thought I was finally getting to the end of it. I saw a figure walking on the opposite side of the road. At first, no big deal, right? Guy walking in the middle of nowhere in the middle of the night. Probably lives nearby, probably drunk. Watch them to make sure they don't fall in front of the car. But my mind is already racing. I mean, this is the middle of nowhere. There are no houses around. There are no lights but the stars and my headlights stabbing out at the darkness. And as I whiz by going way too fast for my own good, I notice two things. First, the figure is wearing what appears to be a straitjacket, the sleeves undone and the straps trailing to the ground. Glaring white against the background of the night. No mistaking it. A straitjacket, hands covered, straps dangling and waving as he walked. Second, it has no face. Not like, there's no head there. There's a head shape. And the place where a face should be, but no face. Just an expanse of darkness that I took to be his skin. I chalked it up to going really fast, contrast between white jacket and dark skin at night, and thinking creepy thoughts. I mean, surely I couldn't have just seen that. I tried to spot him in my rear view mirror, but it was so dark there was nothing to be seen. I slowed down a little, and was suddenly off the end of the bridge and on normal 2-lane blacktop again. I briefly considered turning around, seeing what it was. Surely it was just a trick of the light or my mind playing tricks on me. Right? But I still remember being my heart pounding in fear as I sped on through the darkness, driving home. I was driving home at 4 a.m. or so from my night job, and it was just me on an empty highway as far as I could see. I saw a woman in a white mini dress and no shoes running down the highway screaming. She had makeup smeared all down her face and her hair was all fucked up. I slowed down and kind of stopped, staring at her. I was thinking of every horror movie ever seen, and yep, this is how it starts. She ran up to my car window and I nearly peed my pants because yep, not makeup and fucked up hair, blood everywhere all over her face, and her hair was missing / smeared with blood and spots. About half a mile down the road there was a rollover accident. Convertible, no seat belts. All 3 people drunk. Bloody mini-dress woman was the only survivor, and she was damn disfigured from road burn, and she ran half a mile in the dark down a highway trying to get help for her friends. I called 911 and waited with this poor drunk bloody woman in my car. God, it was awful. I had nightmares for years of her running right towards my car on an empty road. Don't drive drunk without seat belts in a convertible. There are easier ways to die. Also, I saw a little bit of the other 2 bodies as I drove past the police barricade, out of the corner of my eye, enough to know that I never ever want to rubberneck accidents again. One night during my 3rd year in college, I was driving home from an evening summer class. I remember Britney Spears was just starting to come back, so I was bopping and singing along to her music. About 10 p.m. when I was turning into the road my house was on, it's out in suburbia, no one on the streets, this is important, barely any street lights. As I was turning, this guy just walks out in front of my car. Just from the corner of my eye straight in front of me, he turns and looks at me. And I go over him. The weirdest part is that I know exactly what he looks like: older Caucasian male, salt and pepper hair, fit, orange baseball cap, beige jacket, and dark blue jeans. I still remember how his blue-gray eyes looked at me milliseconds before I hit him. He looked solid, the glare from my headlights bounced off of him. Obviously, even though I didn't hear a thump or feel anything, I thought I just ran over a person, so I immediately pull over to the curb and got out. Except there's no one there. I looked under my car and called out and looked around, but there was no one. I still don't know what it was or might have been. Driving past a monastery that was abolished and destroyed during the reign of King Henry VIII at about 4:30 a.m. on the way to work. I had read a few stories about local folk law and ghosts. It kind of fascinates me and creeps me out at the same time. There are numerous reports of a ghostly nun appearing between 2 set points as you get into the woods when passing. The story goes that the back door of the monastery and the hedgerow on the other side of the road, that since the 50s a little bus shelter marks the end of, was the footpath into town, and this route was haunted by nuns of the past, with numerous reports of figures appearing at last minute in the middle of the road, and even one from a police officer who nearly crashed his bike. Anyhow, pitch black as the open road enters the woods and approach the ruins, I'm thinking about the stories as it's 4:30 a.m. and I'm on my own. I follow the road around, it turns and dips as you round the bus stop bend, and I nearly have a fucking seizure. As my headlights swing into the dip, I'm met with this pillar of white in the middle of the road. I'm surprised poo didn't come out. However, within a split second I realized exactly what it was. No idea what kicked in, but I just went into full-on logic mode. Essentially, the tree's canopy create a cold spot around the ruins, and the lowest point of this cold spot is the exact point on the bend where the nun appears. As warm pre-dawn air gently flows in during summer, this would cause cold air to condensate. Turns out that it is nothing but a patch of fog/mist that forms on any given night when conditions allow. Me and my cousin were on a road trip through Sweden, and it was about midnight. We were in some woods, on a really small road, when we all of a sudden pass a huge Christian cross that has been put up on the side of the road. We keep going, and then there is a church on the top of a hill, with braziers all around it, and we notice that it's a town around it, but there is no light whatsoever in the town, no traffic lights, no lights in any of the houses, it's all pitch black except this lit up church, and we start to joke about children of the corn. As we drive into the town at a slow speed, there was no lights, and we did not want to hit anyone if someone was out walking at night, and when we pass the church, we notice that there is about 100 people outside the church, with torches, just standing there and watching us as we drove by, and we were looking at them in complete silence. It was probably just midnight mass or something, but after about 1 hour on a small road in the woods, in complete darkness, going into that was about as creepy as it gets. I'm driving through Arkansas heading up to Ohio. Neither of these states are places I want to be, but whatever. I had to cross a back road to get between 2 state highways, and before I merged back on I pulled into a gas station to fill up. Maybe it was the late hour, or maybe I was just stupid, but when my TomTom told me to leave the station heading west instead of taking the nearby access road, then cross over the highway and loop back around, I blindly followed it. And this is how I found myself in Nowhere, Arkansas, driving down a pitch black dirt road, desperately looking for the highway. A glint of metal and a faint glow in the distance indicates I'm coming up on something. So I slow down and creep up on what turns out to be a dirty rusted pickup and an oil can fire. Illuminated by the fire is a small group of people, dressed in dark robes with gold trim. Very fancy. And in the middle of them is a redneck wearing nothing but a John Deere trucker's hat, balls deep in the biggest so I've ever seen. The group, the redneck, And even the pig all slowly turned to lock eyes with this poor fucker that just rolled up on this horrible scene. Slowly, I backed up, made a 3-point turn, and left the way I came. I didn't even bother checking the rear view. Back when I was on college, 2006 to 2007, I used to just drive around at night if I couldn't sleep and wanted to clear my head. This was in southeastern Ohio, so once you get away from the highway and towns, there's next to nothing out there. Lots of woods, reclaimed mine land, abandoned buildings. You get the point. So one night I go out for a drive, maybe 2 or 3 at night, and just drive south of town like I often did. I swear to God I had driven that same route a dozen times, but after 15 minutes or so something seems off. It's late though and I was starting to get tired, so I didn't think anything of it. Anyway, I keep driving and eventually decide that I'll turn around on a side street in the next little intersection town, since they should be one coming up soon. Like I said, I've gone this way before. So I keep driving and it just keeps getting more and more desolate. Abandoned barns and farmhouses, weird spotty patches of woods, abandoned looking fields, then suddenly the road just turns to gravel and dirt and I get really uncomfortable. I realize very suddenly that this is not familiar at all and I've definitely never been in this place before. I decided to turn around in the next driveway I see, but then after a patch of woods the road just dead-ended into a little patch of dirt. I turned my car around real damn fast and just booked it back to the last state route I passed and went back to my dorm. I brought a friend back out with me later that week and I swear to God I could never find that place again. Even tried in the daylight. Freaks me out to this day thinking about where the hell I suddenly ended up. For what it's worth, I do realize the strong possibility that I took a wrong turn and ended up somewhere weird, but I never could figure out where that was. This happened just last weekend actually. My sister, her fiancé, and I were headed home after hanging out on a Saturday and looking for a place to eat. We decided on Chili's as it was one of the only places still open that wasn't a Denny's/IHOP/ or fast food place at this time of night. On the way over, a woman comes screaming into the middle of a 5-lane road, trying to flag us down. This is a high traffic road in the middle of the night. She was seriously running away from something to brave running out into traffic like that to get someone's attention. We slow down and ask her what's wrong, and she tells us a man she was with, whom she works with, suddenly turned on her and tried to assault her. She was in hysterics, and we could see the man in question eyeing us from near the intersection. She's pleading with us while hysterical and just repeating that she doesn't know what to do and that she's terrified. She's also on the phone with her dad, asking him to pick her up. After some terrified hesitation, we are all girls, we offer her a ride in our car until her dad can get over here to pick her up. She asks to be brought to a nearby hotel, and while we're waiting out front, another car comes by and tells us the guy had taken off running towards us as soon as we drove away and that we needed to get out of there. We thank her and leave, and sure enough, we see him entering the parking lot just as we're leaving. We hightail it to a nearby Forever 21, this was near a major shopping district when all of this happened, and waited until the girl's dad showed up and took her. All in all, it ended up okay, but our minds were racing as it all happened. We were initially scared of letting her in, because you don't mean to be a cynic, but you do hear about people playing scams like that. But in the end, we thought it was a better decision to possibly die in thinking you'd help someone rather than live with not helping them. Glad she got somewhere safe though. I was driving down this creepy road in New Jersey around midnight called Clinton Road, which is supposed to be haunted. On the way down the road, I saw a bunch of old school all-white Cadillacs that probably belonged to a bunch of KKK members, as there is an abandoned castle-type building in the woods. On the way back of the road, I stopped at what is called Dead Man's Curve or something, and story goes that if you throw a quarter off the bridge, it will bounce back at your car. Story goes that a kid was trying to pick up a coin, and got hit by a car and died near the bridge. Sure enough, I turned my car off, turned off the lights, rolled down my windows, threw a coin off the bridge, and sure enough I heard it hit the ground next to my car about 15 seconds later. I sped out of there. Then, yes, there is more. I was driving, and see some dude walking all weird, and leaning back. Me being a retard, I roll down my window and ask if he's alright, and as he's walking all weird, he forces his head towards me, and forcefully says, "Yeah," in the creepiest voice. He had no shoes or socks on, and his eyes looked all black. I sped out of there. Then some pickup chased me off the road. I'm not superstitious, religious, or anything like that. To this day, it was the weirdest shit that's happened. I have two that creep me the fuck out. The first one, I was driving up to my friend's house who lived in a more rural area just north of town. I would take a highway to a certain point and then hang left on a long dark rural street. There is a particular intersection that would always give me the creeps even if nothing seemed out of place. Every time I approached the light it would turn red and I'd sit there and wait. I've seen cops wait nearby to catch people running it, so I never risked it. One time I was sitting at the intersection with no one else around and noticed there was a broken down car on the opposite side of the intersection. I was thinking to myself how shitty of a place that would be to break down because nothing is close by and it's not particularly busy. The light finally turns green, so I go through the intersection, and a little ways down I happen to glance into my rearview mirror and notice someone standing in the middle of the street. There was just the one light by the intersection, so all I saw was a silhouette of someone standing there, presumably looking at my car drive away. I sped the fuck up and took a different way home later that night. The second instance, I was driving to work early enough where it was still pitch black out. I am about to turn onto the street where my building is located. It went out of nowhere. I'm forced to slam on my brakes because a guy stumbled out from behind a tree into my lane. He had his shirt on sideways, one arm inside his shirt, the other through an armhole bent in an unnatural way. His neck was bent upwards and he was twitching as he was walking. The way he was moving kind of reminded me of the nurses from Silent Hill. As soon as he cleared my lane I gunned it. Not the creepiest thing I've seen, per se, but definitely the most unexpected. My boyfriend at the time, now husband, lived in a neighboring town way out in the middle of the sticks. I'm talking a good 40-minute drive in the middle of cornfields, on a narrow, winding country road. If you followed it long enough, the cornfields would finally clear, revealing a tiny one-street town with one store, a church, and a handful of old houses. I was in my early 20s at the time and driving to his house at about 10 p.m. to see him after he'd gotten off work. I'd made the drive what seemed like 1,000 times before. There were no streetlights, almost never any passing cars. The only light illuminating the road were my headlights. I was lost in thought, singing along to my radio and turning down one of the bends in the tiny narrow road. Suddenly and without warning, high beams from behind my vehicle flooded my entire car, shining directly into my rear view mirror and subsequently blinding me. I swerved into the cornfield on my right. My eyes were so shocked by the sudden illumination in my vehicle that they were watering profusely. I was in shock. Once I was over into the corn off the road, the person with the high beams behind me sped past without stopping. I could only make out that it was an older looking truck. I was at least 25 minutes away from any town, I had not passed any houses, and I never once saw anyone behind me. This person had to have been following me for miles down this road with absolutely no headlights on. I was okay, my car wasn't damaged, but once I got to my boyfriend's home, we got in his car and scoured the street searching for a sign of the truck. It wasn't there. To this day we have no idea who it was or where they could have gone. The only place the road led to was my boyfriend's tiny town. Me and my now boyfriend were driving around upstate SC back roads at about 2 to 4 a.m., so think heavily wooded with thick brush / the sticks unmarked roads barely wide enough for two cars in pitch black darkness. And we drive by a wooden crate just long enough to put a body in probably. I don't think it had a lid, but I didn't let him stop to check it out because I was in the passenger side, and the box was on my side of the road. I wasn't about to get jumped by a fucking zombie ghost or some shit. This may not sound that creepy, but we frequently drove down this road and this was not normal, a big ass wooden crate in the middle of an empty road with nothing leading off of the road anywhere nearby. And to make it creepier, later that day during sunlight hours we drove by again and it was gone. I'm gonna guess it was a drop off of some illegal items or something, but at the time I was too scared to find out what was in it at all. Lol. This happened around 20 years ago, in Johannesburg, South Africa where I grew up. I was driving back very late from a night out at a club. I'd had a couple of beers, these stupid, I know, and, wanting to avoid the main roads, I took a detour down a very quiet and winding back road that bypassed the main road and popped out near my house. Would take a bit longer but much less chance of the cops stopping me. This was about 4 a.m., absolutely nobody on that road at the time. Going pretty slowly, I rounded a sharp left bend in the road and as I did I saw a woman, clearly of black African descent but with the most remarkable albino coloring. Alabaster white skin and hair. She was standing on the verge of the road staring directly in the direction where I was coming from. She was dressed in nothing but a flimsy white skirt. No top, no brassiere. Bare breasts, barefoot. She was grinning. Not just a smile. A manic, horrifying grin showing all her teeth, and as I slowly passed her we locked eyes. As we did, I noticed she was holding a small knife, like a builder's Stanley box cutter, and her hands and wrists were covered in blood. I absolutely crapped myself, nearly lost control of the car, and as soon as I had passed her I sped up. I could still see her in the rear view mirror, looking at me and starting to walk into the middle of the road following in the direction I was driving. I spent a few seconds driving away as fast as I could, watching her in the mirror the whole time, and all I could think was, oh my god, what the absolute fuck is that? Then I rounded the next bend and lost sight of her. I got home, about 10 minutes later, absolutely shaking with fear and in a near panic. After a couple minutes at home, I calmed down a bit and then started worrying that something terrible had happened to her, and that she needed help. There was no way I was going back out, so I called the local police station and told them there was a near naked woman on the road that was hurt, potentially armed, and needed help. They asked my name and I hung up on them. I used to dream about her for months after that. I still wonder to this day who she was and what had happened to her. I can rationalize it now, and most likely she was someone with a mental illness or suffering a psychotic episode and had self-harmed. A part of me wishes I'd stopped to try help her myself, but the honest answer is, the experience terrified me to my core and my only thought at the time was to flee. I dropped my mom off one winter evening to a work party at some restaurant 35 minutes away. On the ride back alone I'm doing probably not even 40 miles per hour on a main route. It's pitch black out, and in suburban upstate New York there are plenty of patches of woodland areas you end up driving through sometimes. As I'm a couple of towns away from home, I notice in the distance one singular headlight on the other side of the road. I thought it was stationary at first, but then I realized it was going maybe like 10 miles per hour as I come up close to it. Before I could even think what's going on here, my headlights shine onto the face of a deer hobbling in the middle of the road, not even a foot away from my left headlight. I freaked out and managed to swerve in time to avoid it. I could only figure that car must have slammed into the deer pretty bad to break a headlight. In turn, I figure that deer must have had at least a few broken limbs from such impact, and given that it was trying its hardest to move around. In the moment it was a hella eerie experience. It was like the slow, single headlight car rolling on the road gave a bit of a creepy/unsettling setting, and then the deer head shining in my headlights after was a bit of a jump scare. But in reality, deer incidences are pretty common in the Northeast US. This could just be chalked up as yet another deer encounter.